This episode of Around the Layout is brought to you by Weather My Trains. Hey, are you like me and the thought of doing a DIY weathering job on an expensive engine leaves you in fear? It's time to call in Rob Arsenault at Weather My Trains. Do what thousands of satisfied customers have done and let Rob help you notch up the realism on your layout with beautifully detailed weathering on your locomotives and rolling stock. To see what Rob can do for you, check out his website at weathermytrains.com. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Around the Layout, where model railroaders come to tell their story. My name is Ray Arnott. So glad you could join us. Tonight, we get to talk to Joe Atkinson. Joe, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Ray. Great to be here.
I just keep running into these Iowa Interstate Mafia guys, and I was told on a past podcast, James McNabb said, you're the Godfather. So I think I've reached the pinnacle of the Iowa Interstate Mafia, and I'm talking right to the top. So looking forward to learning all about that and how that group came together. And of course, your layout, Iowa Interstate 4th Sub, and learning more about how you got into the hobby. So glad to have you here.
I appreciate you having me. Really looking forward to this.
Awesome. Well, let's start in the beginning. How did Joe Atkinson get involved in model railroading?
Well, I took sort of a roundabout route to get here. I started off modeling military aircraft primarily. And over time, I eventually started to get a bit bored with the fact that all this work going into these models, and in the end, they would simply, hang suspended from fishing line in my bedroom or something like that. That was kind of the end of the story for them. And at about that same time, I was, maybe 9 or 10 years old, had a newspaper delivery route, and that took me by a local Burlington Northern yard. And it was a pretty small facility, small enough that I could essentially ride my bike up to it and kind of sit and watch them work without being chased off. And over time, that interest just really took hold. I was just fascinated with the size of the machinery, the smells, the sounds, everything just really drew me in as a kid. And over the next several years, I made that pretty regular stop in my newspaper route. I'd stop and buy a Coke at the local gas station and head a block over and just sit and watch them work. At one point, the entrepreneur in me started to take hold, and I thought, if I can get the guys in the yard tower to subscribe to this newspaper, I've got an excuse to come over here every day. And nice. I never did quite work out, but a couple of sales visits still gave me an excuse to go up in the tower and try. And they were very gracious about telling me no in the nicest possible manner, but at least it let me get up in the tower and see things from that perspective. So
I have a career in sales, and I got to admit, even as an adult, I've pulled the same thing where I go on, it's like, I could kind of play this off as a sales call, but it's not really, and taking advantage of that. But you figured that out as a kid. That's pretty incredible. So military models kind of find their way out. Any lessons taken from that? I mean, you're still doing some modeling, regarding that. So I'm sure it gave you some skills and abilities that you use down the road.
Yeah, it really, I think it came down to just the basics. First of all, might have been just the idea of just patience, because at that time I remember there was always that temptation to just rush through each model, and over time I learned to slow down a bit and really focus on the details more, and started to build an appreciation for that versus just knocking each one out and moving on to the next. But just overall building up of skills over time, and never anything too impressive, I'm sure, but at least it was a chance to try my hand at something, and so it was a good time.
So you start with the prototype. When does the model part of it start to kick in? You talked about seeing some Burlington Northern in that yard. How do you transition over to the model railroad side of things?
To be honest, I'm a little fuzzy on some of those details. I remember getting the typical Tyco train set a couple of times when I was growing up. I don't recall exactly how I made the connection, but there was a club in Omaha, just a few miles from where I lived at the time, and I think there must have been something in the newspaper, or somehow I made a connection with this club, and believe my parents took me over for the initial visit, and then there were a couple of members of the club, both Union Pacific employees, who lived in Council Bluffs, where I'd lived at the time and still do, and they were kind enough to offer to stop and pick me up and take me to work sessions and club meetings and so on, and so that really kind of got things rolling from a model perspective.
Excellent. Was it always the BN or I mean the UP, or what was really kind of your road at the time?
I'd say early on the BN was the closest to me, so that was kind of an early interest. Over time, the influence of all these UP employees that were part of this club started to kind of get my attention a little bit. In my early years of high school, we ended up moving next door to a Union Pacific engineer who was he just loved his job, and it was contagious. I mean, we would stand over our back fence, and he would tell these stories of firing on UP steam back in the day, and just really was excited about what he did, even up to that day. His name was Don Aldridge, and just really had a huge influence on me, and really gave me an appreciation for the UP.
Yeah, I'm sure a passionate employee who's willing to share their stories is kind of a rare thing nowadays, but that's certainly cool to get that firsthand account of the history of the UP, and that'll definitely get the hook in you.
Yeah, definitely. He I remember the UP's 844 came to town during that period, and he drove me down and took me up through the cab, and was just telling me all sorts of stories about his early days on the railroad, and it really so often today it seems like with the current climate, railroad employees don't often seem to enjoy their job a lot, and this was just a kind of a different time back then, and I think the UP was a different railroad at the time as well, but just really had a great influence on me as a kid, and I think would have perhaps had an influence on my career path had the economic climate at the time, been better suited for going to work for the railroad. Sure.
Let's go back to talk about the club for a minute. And what was kind of your bigger takeaways from this? Because I'm a big fan of, if you're getting started in the hobby, I think a club can be a great place to start. And if you get the right one with the right people. Tell me a bit about that club experience and some of the takeaways from it.
Well, I think the big thing for me, I think, was that at the time it was my first real exposure to operating something beyond a loop around the Christmas tree. And I remember really being fascinated with yard switching in particular, that I finally had exposure to a large HO scale yard. And I remember going through, and I didn't have switch lists or anything, but I would sort cars alphabetically, or whatever system came to mind at the time, just to create some challenge, and just really had a great time in doing that. The club members were very, very welcoming, very, very gracious about this kid. I think I was probably 12 or 13 at the time. Coming in, I don't recall ever being discouraged or shooed away or anything. So it was really a great foundation, I think, for just stepping into the hobby.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's, if it's done right and the club is, a welcoming place, I mean, to get that exposure. And I experienced the same thing, in my life, joining a club, and really opened my eyes up to operations. Like you're saying, it takes you out of that continuous loop and shows you what really can be done with model railroading. How long were you in the club for?
I would say maybe 2 to 3 years, if I had to guess. As I got into high school, I mentioned the influence of my next door neighbor, but unfortunately this was also a time when I was starting to get more interested in cars and girls and so on. And typical story where the hobby kind of went dormant then, for a few years, in later high school and college. But once I got out of college, it didn't take long at all to come back in a big way in my life. My first post-college job was out in central Nebraska in Grand Island, and shortly after that, I was transferred to Lincoln, Nebraska. Both had a bit of a UP influence. Grand Island especially had just a terrific amount of traffic and a great place to sit and watch it. And that is where that interest really started to take hold in a big way. It was I was pretty convinced back then that I would never model anything but the UP, and kind of started to take some initial steps in doing so at that time.
Yeah, the prototype reeled you back in again, huh? You started with it as a kid, kind of with the prototype with the BN, and that kind of drew you in. And now again, and later in life, now it's the UP as the prototype drawing you back into the hobby. Talk about those next steps. I mean, you got UP on your mind and whatnot. What was your next model railroading step?
Well, I think seeing the action that was in Grand Island, it was just heavy duty mainline action, just seemed to be nonstop. That was sort of one side of the spectrum, but then we moved to Lincoln, and Lincoln was on the UP was a bit of a wouldn't call it a sleepy branch line, but it was definitely a secondary main line through town, and it had a pretty small yard, and again, kind of took me back to my early days at that BN yard. It was a small facility that was very accessible, and you could sit and just watch the action, and that really started to build my interest in grain movements, in grain elevators, and so on. Lincoln had the line down from the east-west Maine and central Nebraska down to Lincoln, passed through a number of smaller towns with typical small town elevators, and that really started to build my interest in that direction. We then moved back to Council Bluffs, and I started looking at various options. I initially wanted to model something in Iowa, but I was really into the UP, so it was a bit of a challenge there, because the UP didn't really extend into Iowa beyond Council Bluffs at that point, and so I started looking at some proto freelance options, and the one I landed on at the time was related to the ex Wabash Norfolk and Western line that came up to Council Bluffs from central Missouri. I started to look at that and started to sort of build this backstory where that line combined with trackage rights into St. Louis became kind of a Kansas City bypass of sorts, and so in my world, the UP had gotten that line. I believe the story I had come up with was that it was sort of a concession from the Wabash acquisition, that UP got that particular line, and then the trackage rights into St. Louis, and then over time it started to build in influence, much like the Marysville sub out in Nebraska and Kansas.
You built quite a backstory for this proto freelance railroad. Did you have any inspiration as far as the freelance idea, where that kind of came from or was created?
Well, my early days in the hobby, I think my biggest influences, as far as other modelers were concerned, Eric Bruman's Utah Belt was probably top of the list for me. That was just fascinating to me, and really loved everything about that. And then at the other end of the spectrum, Doug Leffler had the Lenawee Central that was just this little Michigan short line, and so I think seeing the two of those, Jim Hediger's Ohio Southern, I think was another one that had really caught my eye, and those really kind of set the course for me in those early days. The idea of modeling a specific prototype was appealing to me, but I was, I guess, very willing to sort of stray from that in the earlier days.
Yeah, I've learned quite a bit since starting this podcast about freelance railroads, because I can tell you a little over a year ago, before I started it, you would have told me freelance, and I go, oh, that's easy, just make up a story. But I've learned it's not that easy. I mean, you got to come up with something that's you can sell. It's a plausible idea, not just all completely imaginary. And boy, I'll tell you, if I had to start over again, I really think I might go to a freelance railroad, because it just sounds like challenging and a lot of fun.
Yeah, definitely. There's some really neat proto freelance work being done out there, and I kind of learned as time went on that I just didn't have the creativity for that. I'm a much better. I'm a terrible artist, I guess you'd say. I'm much more of show me what I need to copy, and I'll do my best to copy that. But if I need to create something out of my head, that's much more challenging for me.
More objective than subjective, perhaps.
Yeah, I spent the early couple decades of my career as a software engineer, so I definitely have that engineer mindset, and things are very, black and white in some ways, and
Yeah,
and so it's that might kind of play into things as well.
I feel sometimes I'm like that. Like I say, sometimes I'm an objective guy playing in a subjective world, like art stuff, it's like, or photography for me, or anything. It's like, okay, what are the rules? Well, it's like, okay, I'm taking a photo. Do I have all the technical stuff? Well, don't worry about the technical stuff. Does it look good? Is this appealing to somebody? Is, the composition done correctly? And, I think it is when you're an objective mind and trying to do very subjective stuff. It can be really challenging. And like you said, as a software engineer, I'm sure there's ways to do things. There's rules to do things. And then you get into art and kind of take the rule book and color on the back side of it, kind of thing.
Yeah, it really, I'm very much like that. When I started down the path of doing my first scenery, it was kind of like, okay, I need steps. I need bullet points. I need someone to tell me, okay, first you do this, then you do this. So that was, very much indicative of my overall mindset, I think.
Yeah. What's the right way to make a tree? Like,
yeah,
it's like, okay, where's the rule book? NMRA section 5, paragraph 3 says, to make a tree, you must, right. That would make it a lot easier for a mind like mine. And sounds like maybe yours too, but there's like 1,500 ways to make a tree and do it on a layout. So yeah, I get that. I hear you. The hobby has been such a neat way to sort of step outside of of what for me is more my natural mindset, though, and it's been a very safe space to expand into more artistic avenues, I guess. And I really look at the hobby now as I look at layout construction as just 3D art, essentially, and so it definitely throws its own challenges at you. I think it's one of my favorite things about the hobby is that you have so many different skills to build upon and to grow, and there's just such a variety of things that we can dabble in and start to learn a bit more about, and you never reach the end of that, I don't think. No, it definitely has an kind of an infinity to it, right? It's just, endless what you can and do. I mean, whatever's in the world can be, on a model railroad, there's no real limit to it. Just whatever your capability is to it. So where did you, how far did you take this freelance idea before you kind of put the kibosh to it?
Well, I think it was my initial interest in the UP started to take off in about '87, and I honestly I think that that freelance aspect of it continued right on up until I finally sort of discovered the Iowa Interstate in my backyard. I'd spent decades in Council Bluffs at that time, and I'd seen them operate locally, but it just never really caught my eye very much. I'd take I'd let an Alco go by me and kind of, take an occasional snapshot and, oh, that's nice. And then go across town and shoot one of 32 million SD40-2s on the UP. So it was it was really about that I would say right around 2000 that I started to maybe tire a little bit of all the lookalike power on the UP, and there was a trip in June of 2000 where my wife and I spent the night at a bed and breakfast in Atlantic, Iowa, and that night we just kind of got out and just drove around, just explored a little bit, and drove over to Anita, Iowa, a couple of towns to the east. And as it turns out, this is the very segment of the Iowa Interstate that I'm now modeling, and it took me 20 more years to get to that, to the point of where I ended up there. But that trip really opened my eyes to the possibilities of modeling a smaller railroad like this, and also showed me that I could really kind of have my cake and eat it too, because just a few years prior to that, the Iowa Interstate was hosting a number of detours, of UP detours specifically, up to, I think there was one day that they had 8 in a single day. And seeing the smaller towns here and just seeing the approachability of the railroad, the facilities, you could walk up and you could measure things, you could photograph things, and employees were just super friendly, and it just started started the wheels turning, I guess, with regard to maybe modeling the Iowa Interstate, having a bit more variety in the locomotives and equipment I could model, while at the same time not having to just ditch all my UP stuff and go cold turkey. So that was kind of where things took off. And at the same time, that was when the prototype bug really bit me hard. I mean, from that point forward, I really never looked at any sort of proto freelance layout ideas, didn't entertain anything like that going forward from there. I had along the way, I'd had had some exposure to some other very serious prototype modelers. Gary Rowe is a good friend that reached out to me. He's a Wabash modeler, but reached out to me after my first layout based on that Wabash line was in a magazine, and Gary started to send me information about the line, had all sorts of prototype documentation and everything. And so that really got things going. And then in 1995, I think it was, I had a business trip to Minneapolis. And I was up there off and on over about a month, and had an opportunity during that time to visit Bob Rivard's Sioux Line layout there. And Bob takes prototype modeling, I think, to a whole different level. He was kind of a no compromises kind of guy, where he had I think it's safe to say that he had very little regard for like things such as aisle space and accessibility. I think there was one scene on Bob's layout where you literally had to get down and crawl in order to get back to a scene, but he arranged things out of I'll say prototype purity first and foremost, and and everything else, was second to that. And it was a fascinating experience to drive around and see the prototype scenes that he had modeled right there in Minneapolis in that area, and then to visit his layout and see the exact scene that was scaled down and just was an incredible recreation of it, and so that kind of planted a seed with me and really started to make me consider what was possible from a prototype modeling standpoint.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing to do that, to be able to go to a layout and recognize and go, hey, I've been there, or I know where exactly this is. It really is a real cool, a nod to the modeler who can do that, who can recreate it so well that you recognize it. And for you, obviously very inspiring to go into that prototype path.
It really was. I don't think I ever executed to the extent that Bob did, but for me, I think it came down to just finding that right prototype, and the one that just fit my desires, fit my personality as closely as possible. And for me, the Iowa Interstate was that. It was the kind of environment where there were friends online that I became close with. Alan Hunt is a 35-year Iowa Interstate employee and was really key in encouraging me in those early days and ever since, really. Again, a railroad employee who was just really excited about his job and very willing to answer questions and tell me pretty much anything I needed to know to get started. And between getting to know Al and making myself kind of a regular fixture at the local Iowa Interstate yard and chasing their trains around the area. There were a lot of good friendships that were built then. The Iowa Interstate has never had, it's never a railroad where you're going to stand in one place and all the trains are going to come to you. But I found that the way you did typically rail fan the Iowa Interstate was just very appealing to me. The trains are moving at a much slower pace, and it's easy to kind of leapfrog ahead of them as you're out chasing a local or something like that. And you can get right, you can get up close to the action, and as long as you were showing concern for safety, and they were always very very accommodating, and so over the years that really turned into a lot of great opportunities. Following the locals around throughout the area, building those friendships, eventually started to turn into cab ride invitations and just a number of things that you could never repeat today with the change in climate and the in-cab camera systems and so on. But at that time, it was kind of a different world, and I was told I sort of had the run of the place to a certain extent. It was told to let them know when I wanted to stop down, if I needed photos, wanted to ride along on a job, whatever, those doors were open, and it really gave me an opportunity to see the railroad from the employee's perspective to a certain extent, and just made a very educational time in doing so.
Seems like a very open, amazingly open operation to, guys that are, an operation that's willing to share with someone like you that wants to learn about the Iowa Interstate and, the cab rides and all that. I guess it was fun while it lasted and that era, but tell us more about, for somebody that doesn't know, about the Iowa Interstate, what were some of the things that, that your big things that you've learned about that railroad?
Well, it's funny because the Iowa Interstate of the early 2000s, you wouldn't recognize it today. It at the time they were, I think it's safe to say that they were still struggling a bit. They had definitely had some harder times behind them. There were some times in the 80s and 90s when things were a bit tenuous, but by the 2000s, I think they'd started to turn a bit of a corner and get a bit more traffic. And they've always been, for this portion of the railroad, it's always been kind of a 2 train a day operation, one eastbound, one westbound. You'd have the occasional grain extras as well. You'd have locals out there working. But they kind of stayed true to that 2 train a day principle throughout the years. So yeah, it's been. I think their traffic has always been, or back then at least, was very heavily dominated by intermodal and grain. Had a lot of scrap guns and so on. Just had a really neat mix of equipment. Their locomotives at the time, really, no two were alike. There were some that I think they had one batch of 4 that came from the same lineage, came from the ICG and originally from the GM&O. These 4 GP38 ACs. But that was about as close as they got during those earlier years to having, somewhat of a something, resembling any kind of consistency on the roster. And then 2004 came along, and they really started to turn a corner. They got their first -2 locomotives. They took delivery of 22 refurbished ex Conrail GP38-2s and 4 SD38-2s that really started to. It was the arrival of that equipment that really got my attention and kind of set my era pretty definitively at that point, because that was power that I was definitely interested in, but I liked the juxtaposition of these nicely painted newer units against the some of the rustier, a bit rougher locomotives that they'd gotten their start with. So it's really made for a lot of fun in modeling that variety, and then and also having the variety of all of this equipment set against modern UP power that was running on the detours. So,
did they in the prototype, when they brought all that in, did they paint right away, or did they run them in Conrail scheme for a while, or how did they handle it?
The GP38-2s all arrived in Iowa Interstate paint. They all went through Mid-American Car in Kansas City and were completely refurbished there, repainted, clear coated. To this day, they still have a pretty decent shine on them. And the SD38-2s, they showed up in LLPX blue and white, kind of that GM leasing scheme. And they were leased from locomotive leasing partners for the first, I think it was 6 months, and then after that period, they were purchased, and the four of them were cycled down to Mid-America Car again, and went through the same refurbishment and paint process that the Jeeps had.
So it was a smaller railroad per se, but still, putting out a good image makes it easy to model, right? They actually care what they look like, and kind of makes that a very appealing road to model.
Yeah, definitely. And that's been something that I think has always been kind of a calling card for the Iowa Interstate, that they do take great care in taking care of their equipment. They wash their locomotives by hand even to this day. I believe it's every 90 days. And even back then, before they had a more modern facility like they do today for locomotive maintenance, just working out of this old Rock Island engine house in Council Bluffs, they really did some amazing things. It was really a testament to the employees there. There was a locomotive that was involved in a grade crossing accident in the late 90s. The Iowa Interstate 400. It was actually it was the only ex Rock Island unit on this ex Rock Island line, and it had been pretty heavily damaged as part of this grade crossing accident after hitting a gravel truck. Sat outside of the Council Bluffs shops for, I want to say, 2 or 3 years, and I believe it was in 2001, 2002. They started to go to work on it, and they practically rebuilt the thing from scratch. It seems like they took a long hood off of a Paducah GP8. It just was kind of a Frankenstein of sorts, but by the time they got done, it looked like it was right off the factory floor. I mean, it had a shine to it that you just couldn't believe, and really showed a lot of pride in rebuilding this. Probably a 50-year-old locomotive at that time, and similar things. There was a GP9, an ex-C&O high hood GP9 that was kind of a favorite of mine, the 303. That while it never got the external care that some of these others did, it was always in this kind of ratty green scheme that had about literally, I think it had 5 different shades of green. It had been patched and repatched multiple times, but they rebuilt, or they rewired that, I think it was in the early 2000s, and the chief mechanical officer later told me that after that rewiring, that locomotive had something like I believe it was a 97% availability, which apparently stacked up very well with even the most modern EMDs and GEs out there. So it again was just a testament to the work ethic of the team there and at the Council Bluffs shop.
Iowa Interstate seems like a railroad easy to fall in love with, isn't it? They're just doing all these things right, so it's no wonder why you had an appeal to them. As far as the locomotives go, you talked about the roster for modeling it. Was a lot of this available commercially? Were you able to, or was this a challenge in custom painting?
I think that is probably where my old aircraft modeling days came into play as much as anything. When I first started out, I think the extent of what was offered in for the Iowa Interstate, Walters had one of their, I think it was a 45-foot trailer, decorated for Iowa Interstate, and Microscale had a couple of decal sets. And Walthers, I think, had a covered gun that was that had already been retired, I think, or a series of the series of 12 had been retired by the time of my modeling era. But so it was pretty much, if I wanted it, it was going to be starting with undecorated and doing the paint and decaling and detailing and so on. But that really was part of the attraction for me after becoming a bit bored with some of the UP power that I was modeling prior to that. I'd love this idea of each of these locomotives having its own personality, and every one of their GP38s had a different lineage, and as a result had different fuel tank size and different horn placement, and some had dynamics, some did not, and some had different styles of fans, and it just made things just a lot of fun to really dig into those details. Even when those ex-Conrail Jeeps started to show up, a friend of mine, Andy Brown, used to give me a lot of grief over those because they were pretty much identical on the surface, but still, as you started to get into the details, the more you dug, the more unique they became. Andy especially liked to give me grief over the fact that at one point in my research on those, I started to document the location of the toilet vents on the short hood of these locomotives, because every one was just a little bit different, and I wanted to make sure that I got those details right in modeling them, and so that is really that's just been one of those things that's just for me, that's much more fun than modeling stuff that's right off the factory floor, and so as a result, my interest in the railroad has really kind of I've really kind of dropped anchor right there in May of 2005, because beyond that point, a few years later, they started to get brand new GE locomotives and all of this older stuff that held such interest for me slowly started to be cast off. So that my employee friends at the railroad have taken notice of the fact that I don't come around quite as much anymore, just because it's kind of a different situation now. It's a bit like still a very friendly railroad, very friendly, just terrific people working there, and it's great to see them enjoying the kind of success that they are right now. But at the same time, they look a lot like a mini Class 1 these days. So
yeah, the new stuff doesn't have quite the appeal of the more characteristic older stuff, it seems.
Yeah, and I've never been a big fan of the GE safety cab type locomotives. So you get to about 1989 on the Class 1s, and I'm pretty much done as far as my interest level. But the Iowa Interstate, it seemed like it was a bit like, in 2005, it was a bit like a 1970s Class 1 in some ways.
So we're kind of fast forwarding here, so make sure we get a chance to talk about it, because I'm sure everybody's wants to hear a little bit about your Iowa Interstate Subdivision 4 West End layout. featured in the Model Railroad Planning in 2011. You mentioned January 2018 Railroad Model Craftsman. It's been covered. I just processed a podcast everybody will hear by the time this comes out. And James McNabb talked about your layout, and boy, did he sing your praises. Maybe that moves him up in the mafia. I'm not sure. But he called you the Godfather and said that your layout became his benchmark. And I'm wondering, do you think James has been able to reach that benchmark with his layout?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I have just had a great time with my fellow Iowa Interstate modelers, and they're without exception reaching a lot more notoriety than I am. James and Scott Thornton with his Milan branch, and they have really done beautiful work, and it's been a lot of fun to get to know them, and to have some fellow Iowa Interstate modelers that I can commiserate with when we're discussing the availability of models at times, but yeah, over time that it seems like the railroad really has taken off from a modeling standpoint, and those days of having to custom paint everything are definitely behind us. There are Iowa Interstate models from a wide variety of manufacturers now, and so it is definitely a much more achievable railroad to model these days. But yeah, my mafia cohorts have been very kind to me through the years, and very gracious. But I'm not sure how the Godfather thing came about, other than maybe I'm just the oldest. But
maybe it could be that, or I would just take it as a title of honor. And I'll tell you, I've talked to, you're now the fifth that's on my list here, and of course maybe there's more that I haven't known about or aren't revealing themselves at this point. But all great guys, all enthusiastic, and it's seemingly that the mentality. Which could be, hey, that's my railroad, go pick something else. But you guys all seem to support it. Why each other enjoys the Iowa Interstate idea, and you help lift each other up.
It's funny, for being a fairly relatively small railroad. It's 500 miles, but there's really been very little overlap with regard to segments that are being modeled. There's still a pretty nice variety of things you can do there if you're interested in heavier duty, more mainline type action. My friend Colin O'Brien is doing the third sub with a modeling of the central portion of the railroad that is by far the busiest, and doing a beautiful job of modeling that. James and Scott have both chosen different, I'll say, industrial lines that have very unique feels to each of them. Definitely, very interesting, each of them in their own right. I've tended to get much more interested in grain elevator switching. My initial Iowa Interstate layout was based on the far west end of the railroad from Council Bluffs to Atlantic, and it was kind of a mix. It was about half of it was dedicated to the Council Bluffs terminal and the interchange with the UP and BNSF, and the other half was was more focused on the grain elevator switching in rural western Iowa. And as after we moved a few years ago, or as we prepared to move, I started to look at what I wanted to do next, and that rural portion of the layout was what really stood out to me. And I started looking for, what part of the railroad would best scratch that itch, and really by just jumping to the very next segment to the east of what I was already modeling, starting at Atlantic and then moving on east to Adair, I landed right in the heart of their busiest grain producing segment, and so that's kind of what the new layout is based on. Much more laid back, much more just a relaxed type of feel to it, but it's been an interesting new challenge in its own right.
Talk about operations on it. Do you have like regular operating, or is this kind of a lone wolf thing? How do you handle that?
I'm on the old layout. I was doing, I won't say regular operations. I think I had a total of like 35 sessions over my 20 years there. The new one is not quite to the point of being ready yet, but I expect it to be probably late this year. And when that happens, I definitely look forward to getting back into that. I have found that over time, when I built the last layout, I definitely built it with the thought that if you're going to operate, of course you've got to be able to support 10 operators and 25, 30 trains, and the more the more I went down that path, the more I realized that just wasn't for me. That here I was, having these guys up, and they were operating on the railroad, and they were kind of so caught up in it, and I was so caught up in making sure that everything was working properly, that I never really had much of a chance to interact with my guests, and so that was one big change that took place when we moved. The new layout is about half the size of the old one, and only meant to support really just 1-2-man crew. It is much more of a much more geared toward just having that sort of relaxed time to sort of operate and kind of chat a little bit and just get to know people a little bit more, versus being an observer on the old layout. So
I think that's kind of lost in some railroads, the social aspect. If you go and it's like work, you put on perhaps a headset if you're using radios or whatever, and you kind of get lost in it, and it becomes a job. Before you know, you're really having much of a conversation with anybody, and an hour or two or even more have gone by. It is nice to have that where you're not, it's a relax, like you said, just come, show up, run the train. You're not in a huge rush. You're not jamming up 10 other guys behind you. You're just, you're enjoying that. So there's a lot to be said for that.
Yeah, definitely. I found that as my responsibilities in my day job have grown, my desire to inflict any sort of stress on myself after working outside of working hours has definitely dropped off, and I'm much more in the mindset now of kind of going back to the cab ride days, and instead of looking at this from the standpoint of, well, I'm I want to stand back and watch a dozen trains pass over my prototype or my layout. It's much more like just recreating those days of riding along and watching them work or following them along in the car and shooting things as they work, getting kind of up close to the action and having a chance to really see what they do and better understand why they do things. And it's, to me, it's that's where the interest has really grown. I've really I've gotten very deeply into slowing things down. I've got my I've focused exclusively on low sound decoders, and I've got them configured to max out at something like 12 miles an hour, and I've just found that on a layout of this nature with 30-inch radius minimum radius curves, going much faster than that just starts to bring back images of those days around the Christmas tree as a kid. And so I really definitely jumped on board in a big way with the various toys, I'll say, that kind of slow things down, like working derails. And I'm a huge fan of the proto throttle. I have my turnouts set up so that they those that were locked with a transportation department lock on the prototype have a separate lock from those that were that were locked with an engineering, like, maintenance away type of lock. So if you need to work to pull a ballast gun out of a maintenance away track in Atlantic Yard, you need to talk with the train master or the road master, rather, to get the maintenance away crew out there to unlock that particular track. And those kinds of things would probably drive some people nuts, but to me, it's just bringing back memories of really positive times and really good times watching them work.
That's kind of the magic of model railroading too. The ability to capture a memory within that miniature size that you've done there. And really neat ideas about slowing operations down too. It doesn't take a huge railroad to spend some time on. You can do it, and there's tricks, and like you said, there's ways to slow it down. And I'm one that I've got about 20 linear feet of bench work, and I can keep 3 guys busy for 2.5 hours. It's all in the sequencing, and it's about slowing it down too. And by the way, my locomotives are at 10 miles an hour, so I know exactly where you're coming from. Speed does not look right in compression. It's got to be slow and make it look good. And I mean, remember, you're going from here to here. It would typically take a long time to pass between 2 places, and if you're doing 40 miles an hour scale, it looks like a rocket. So it just doesn't work.
Yeah, it really, I think that specifically is a really neat way to, I'll say quite literally, grow your layout. When it takes you, you're cranking your top speed down to that extent, and it takes you several minutes to get across even a fairly small layout. It really does make you realize just how little space you truly need. I'd be, if we had to move and downsize at some point, I'd be happier with something even smaller than what I have now. And it just it's really amazing how that comes into focus as you experience operations firsthand.
Absolutely. We've gone an hour 6. We don't even have enough time to cover all the things that we could cover with you and what you have going with the Iowa Interstate. But we'll definitely get you back on the show. We've got a lot more questions regarding this and a lot more to talk about. But for now, I want to thank you for coming on Around the Layout and sharing your story.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Ray. It's been a real pleasure to be here, and really have enjoyed the podcast a great deal.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Around the Layout. Learn more about today's show on our Facebook page, facebook.com/Around the Layout. Show your support by becoming an operating crew member at patreon.com/Around the Layout podcast. Past episodes and more can be found on our website, aroundthelayout.com. And send us your feedback, aroundthelayout@gmail.com. Thanks for hanging out with us around the layout.